a hot field under the afternoon sky. Every spring, the American farmer has faced this flat and far-reaching landscape with unbounded optimism since the first plow broke the soil. Horses, mules, and oxen turned over the first furrows. But as the prairie grass gave way to vast tracts of cultivated acreage, a better way was needed to plow and plant and harvest. So we hunkered down and invented the tractor. This is a story about the American farm tractor, told with the actual antique machines that sowed and reaped the harvest. It's also a story about the men who collect and restore these machines. About a craftsman who built his own. And about some rare and special miniature tractor collections. For the most part, we're talking about working farmers. And for farmers working the land around the turn of the century, there was only one answer when it came to separating the crops from the chaff. And that was steam power. Over 7 tons of iron and steel driven by the power of steam under pressure. This Nichols and Shepard traction engine of 1917 is typical of the great land engines that worked America's farmlands for over 30 years. The steam engine was first used to provide belt power to stationary machines. Horses towed it to where the work was being done. Later, the engines became self-powered and were called steam traction engines, crisscrossing the country's farms doing contract or custom work for the farmers.
Dad had, I think, 2 or 3 rings, as they were called, and the neighbors, the farmers, would band together, and they'd form a thrashing ring, and they had possibly 6 or 8 bundle wagons. They'd have 4 pitchers. They'd probably have 2 or 3 grain wagons, and they would pool their labor together and go around custom thrash each one's grain. And I think at the time, I'm not sure what he charged, but last I remember was 3 cents for oats, 5 cents for wheat, and 7 cents for rye.
Clanking along behind the steam traction engine was the threshing machine. These clattering, awkward-looking contraptions made of wood or tin over a steel structure were surprisingly efficient even by today's standards. This restored thresher was made by J.I. Case. When the threshing machine was rolled into place on level ground, horse-drawn wagons called hay racks brought loads of wheat, barley, oats, or rye in from the field. The machine was driven by a long leather belt slipped around the flywheel of the steam engine. With a hay rack alongside the machine's feeder, 2 men pitched the bundles onto the moving conveyor. Sharp claws helped tear apart the bundles as they were fed into the cylinder. This cylinder was equipped with metal teeth called spikes, or long bars called rasps, that separated the grain and the chaff from the straw. As the cylinder spun, its momentum tossed the chaff and grain onto the straw walkers that moved up and down, shaking the grain through a series of sieves. The chaff and straw was blown by a fan into a stack that blew out the back of the machine. Meanwhile, the grain was carried up an elevator to a weigher atop the thresher. As grain filled the weigher, its weight tripped a release, and a measured portion dropped down to the auger chute, where it was spewed out into a cart or a bagger. A counter next to the weigher kept track of each weighed measure. Everyone pitched in during threshing time as the machine was moved from farm to farm. Mechanizing farm operations changed the American farmer from being the source of power to being the director of power. While the process of threshing remained the same, petroleum-based fuels gradually replaced steam power. The terms kerosene traction and gasoline traction were used. To simplify everything, shortly after the turn of the century, the term tractor was coined. This Aultman-Taylor tractor, built in 1919, runs on kerosene, a cheap fuel that was plentiful in rural America, where kerosene lamps lit most of the homes and barns. The engine had only one speed forward and reverse. This Avery tractor was built in 1917 and required priming with gasoline to get it started. It runs on kerosene the rest of the time. Gas has a higher volatility and ignites at the spark caused by the magneto from a spin of the flywheel. Weighing in at 7,500 pounds, the Avery was lighter and more fuel efficient than the Aultman-Taylor, and foretold the scaling down of tractor designs. The engine had two cylinders opposed, laid flat on the frame, and cranking at 700 RPM. Its most advanced feature, however, was a primitive transmission that controlled forward and reverse. At the heave of a lever, the entire engine frame shifted from one gear to another.
The Hyder tractor is unique in that the frame, the engine slides in the frame, and you can change the speed this way. And you have 7 different speeds, and it's a friction drive, no transmission. One side of the drum that you see there is a reverse, and the other side is forward. And you can just work out just like a shuttle, move the lever forward, you go forward, and move it back, you're going backwards.
Tractors gave 3 kinds of power. Power to the belt drive for running stationary machines such as threshers, power to the drawbar where drawn implements like plows were attached for towing, and power to the road for moving from place to place. This Hyder 1220 offers 12 horsepower at the drawbar for towing implements and 20 horsepower at the belt for operating machines in the field. Heck, it took 8 horsepower just to move itself. A unique tractor development emerged as the larger plowing and belt machines continued to evolve, and that was the motor cultivator. While the large steam and kerosene tractors continued to ply their trade, These smaller motor cultivators were designed like the old horse plows, power plant well forward representing the horses, and the farmer seated in a sulky seat well to the rear. Numerous cultivation implements could be slung beneath, much like this single-bottom plow on the Allis-Chalmers 612. Some motor cultivators even steered with reins, just like old Dobbin. While the machine replaced some horse flesh with horsepower, the idea never became a big seller, because most farmers with average-sized farms could not afford both a plowing and belt tractor and a motor cultivator, regardless of how close it resembled the nostalgic horseplow. During the years 1917 and 1918, what with the wartime demands on our agriculture, farmers were looking for an efficient, affordable small tractor that could pull its own weight. Scaling down in size from the large plowing and belt tractor of the pre-war period, the 1917 Hart Parr appeared with a two-cylinder water-cooled engine, a friction drive, and two-speed transmission. This design helped establish the basic layout for the machines that would follow. After the Hart Parr, other manufacturers' designs wouldn't fall far from that tree. Ask any Hart Parr tractor historian, and he'll say that machine started the tractor industry in the United States. Henry Ford's 1918 Fordson became the first mass-produced tractor, the tractor for every man. It was cheap at $875, complete with an Oliver No. 7 chilled steel plow. And since it had no heavy frame, it was light, weighing only 2,700 pounds. The Fordson was underpowered compared to most machines of the period, but offered a workable 10 horsepower at the drawbar and gave out 20 horsepower on the belt drive. In 1920, the Ford assembly line produced 67,000. Actually, it was so lightweight, flat shoes seen here on the rear fenders were provided to keep it from tipping over backward under a heavy load, an all too common problem that put a lot of farmers in the hospital, and worse. By 1918, the John Deere Waterloo Boy had made its appearance. It tipped the scales at 6,183 pounds and pulled with an honest 12 horsepower. It offered 25 horsepower at the belt. At first, it didn't sell very well, only about 5,000 in 1918. But the Boy caught on, as proved by this 1922 model owned by J. Bonnell. From this design, acquired when Deere bought the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, John Deere began a long line of evolving two-cylinder tractors. A tractor price war in 1920 saw the cost of a Fordson drop to $395. Other tractor builders slashed their prices, and many went under. During the later 1920s and through the 30s, the standard tractor with its steel-cleated wheels and multi-cylinder engines evolved as designers experimented. These new machines were essentially unstyled tractors. Their operating parts, the engine, steering mechanism, cooling radiator, and controls were arranged on a frame in the most practical, straightforward way. By the late 1930s, tractor designers had labored hard to incorporate new innovations. Besides wide-set front wheels, a farmer could get narrow-set front wheels called a tricycle row crop to fit between two rows. Engines ran on gasoline for better efficiency. Electric lights and ignition systems had been improved, and water cooling was standardized. By 1932, thanks to Allis-Chalmers, tractors began running on rubber tires instead of the teeth-jolting cleated steel. The battery start had replaced the hand crank and flywheel. Mechanical power lifts were fitted to raise implements clear of the ground for transport without having to move levers by hand while running over bumpy ground. dangerous proposition. But for all the mechanical innovation, the unstyled tractors still hung on to a clunky, hammered-together appearance. An extra touch was needed to peddle more tractors, and that was style. Styling was everywhere. Folks loved the smooth, sleek lines. John Deere was second to International Harvester in sales. The two-cylinder tractors, with their distinctive popping exhaust sound, earning the nickname Johnny Poppers, or Poppin' Johnnies, depending on where you hailed from, had earned their spurs since the 1918 Waterloo Boy. To give their tractors a market edge, they hired the famous industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss. His charge was to help us make our tractors more saleable. And that he did. New sheet metal work and a new front-end design added the beauty touches. Realigning the front stacks improved visibility. The steering shaft was enclosed. A wider seat was designed to relieve fatigue. The engineers hunted around until they found a guy in the plant with the biggest behind and had him sit in plaster. From that mold, every John Deere seat was built. Styling touches added safety as well as good looks. The new styled A and B models were introduced in 1939. From the closing of the 1930s, the sky was the limit for tractor design. As designs changed, so did the fuels that ran the tractors. Around the turn of the century, steam was king. Steam powered locomotives on rails, and it powered traction engines across the farms of America. All you needed was water, something to make a fire, and a boiler to make the steam that drove the pistons and powered the long leather belt. Traction engines were huge, weighing up to 10 tons, and needed much of their power just to lumber across the fields and bad roads to the workplace. While locomotives of that time burned anthracite coal, traction engines often burned what was at hand: coal, wood, and even straw. While the railroads spent time to find good water for locomotives that was lime and alkali-free, farm engines often pumped their water from a pond or ditch. Operating a steamer required skill and a thorough knowledge of steam pressures and power transfer from the pistons to the wheels or the belt. A good traction engine operator in rural America was as revered as any locomotive engineer. Petroleum-based fuels and internal combustion motors allowed the traction engines to lighten up, but added some cost to the process, since the farmer had to buy the more expensive fuel rather than chop wood or recycle straw. As we said before, kerosene was the fuel of choice, since it was needed for lamps and could be stored because of its low volatility. Kerosene tractors had to be primed and started with gasoline because that fuel vaporized more quickly for better ignition from the hand-cranked magneto. Once they were warmed up, the kerosene was fed to the engine for working power. As petroleum companies refined their gasoline-making process and the price came down, gas became the popular fuel. It burned more efficiently than kerosene and allowed designers to build smaller, more powerful engines. When World War II forced gas rationing, farmers asked the government if they could distill their own fuel from their crops. The government saw alcohol stills popping up all across the country and said no. The idea never went away, however, and eventually became the catalyst for ethanol, made from corn, that runs in our tanks today. By 1944, diesel engines were becoming popular. They burned almost anything from furnace oil to hair tonic, ran well, required little maintenance, and were mechanically efficient. The Oliver Corporation was the first manufacturer to put a diesel engine in a tractor. Their sales took off, and soon almost all large tractors had diesel engine. As one farmer said, "Well, they work good, and the help can't siphon off the tank for their own automobiles." Commercial propane fuel showed up in the early 1950s. It burned clean and equaled gas tractor performance. Propane had become a popular heating fuel on farms, so it was readily available. Propane tractors could always be spotted by the bulbous tank that straddled the upper frame. As you can see, getting the tractor to the field has been as much of a challenge as what to do with it when you got it there. Throughout the design life of the American tractor, special designs were created for special jobs. Some were experiments that kind of went nowhere, like this 1914 Allis-Chalmers three-wheeler. Their advertising department said this tractor was a joy for the boy, if you can believe that. Others were built to fill a need, like a pocket version for a smaller farm. Exit the Case 2240. And here's the Case 1018. Orchard tractors had extra sheet metal to keep branches out of the wheels. High crop designs worked over taller and taller crops. Any higher and you'd get a nosebleed. They were used on battlefields after being painted olive drab and dropped by parachutes secured by special rings welded in place. When the call went out for a military general purpose vehicle, tractor manufacturer Minneapolis Moline submitted this experiment. Underpowered and overweight, it was beat out by the Willys Overland Jeep. The U.S. Navy saw some use in all that low-end torque to tow aircraft around landing fields. With its tractor-like pulling muscle, it could have also towed the hangar. A few designs were painted safety yellow and adapted to industry, like this little Oliver used for highway maintenance. And still others were built for a very special purpose, such as this Allis-Chalmers Model G with a rear engine built in 1948. It was mostly used by vegetable farmers. Look familiar? Yep, our old friend, the motor cultivator, but backwards. This idea sort of scaled down and eventually became today's garden rototiller. Some older farm tractors have been adapted to more domestic use, like this lineup of exotic and very heavy-duty lawnmowers. All the tractors we've used to offer this glimpse into the history of agricultural horsepower have been collected by farmers who still work the land. Each has his own reason for choosing a particular manufacturer, a particular era, or even engine design. Like Maury Horn's collection of Poppin' Johnny two-cylinder John Deeres. That's a sound that catches everyone's attention. Almost everyone, that is. Oh, don't go away mad. Well, anyway, these collections reflect the diversity of tractor technology and the appeal of the machines to farmers who, in most cases, must be their own mechanics when it's time to plant and harvest. One thing is certainly true. A collection doesn't have to be big to be special. Jim Reber's McCormick Deering ended the era of heavy tractors for International Harvester back in 1921. It has a one-piece iron frame and unit construction for ease of service. This was a plowing and belt tractor that was offered as the 1530. But later on, in 1929, it received a bigger engine and became the 2236. This was the first tractor to offer the power takeoff shaft from the engine to operate towed implements. Trailing behind it is the ingenious Little Genius plow. This International Harvester plow was designed for the average farm and featured a unique chain lift that could be cranked up from the driver's seat. A real innovation in those dangerous days of walking the plow to manually raise it over obstructions, or at the end of a row. That plow design lasted into the modern tractor era and could be found behind the tractor that changed just about everything, the International Harvester Farmall. Introduced in 1924, the unstyled Farmall was the first tractor to offer everything a farmer needed: plowing, belt work, and cultivating, with 15 different implement designs for use with virtually any crop.
Farmall, first of all, you could use it for row crops. You could cultivate with the Farmall. And the F30 was a big brother to the F20. It could pull three bottom and just it was for the larger farm. But it was just an all-around tractor. And whereas McCormick Deering, it was strictly a plow tractor, stationary tractor, things like that. But the Farmall really started the tractor era, really.
The early Farmall design developed into a family of International Harvester tractors. These belonged to Clyde Berkshire of Royal Center, Indiana, an International Harvester dealer for 37 years. He collects anything having to do with International Harvester. His Farmall collection reflects a progression from unstyled to styled models, all in fully restored condition. Fully restored means the tractor has been reconditioned and painted to resemble as much as possible its appearance and operation when brand new. This requires months of hard work: scraping, sanding, painting, machining, and hunting up original parts. Bill Gamble of Wilshire, Ohio, has assembled this lineup of styled Oliver tractors, all in restored condition, ranging from the Model 60 of 1945 to the heavy-duty Model 99 introduced in 1953. Bill started out collecting almost by accident, or, as he tells it,
well, I guess the way I got into collecting tractors was I had a friend that collected cars, and he'd spend a lot of time getting them reupholstered and one thing and another, and I thought collecting tractors would be easier and a little more maybe along the line of what I'd like to do. And the reason I got started on Olivers, when I was a kid, I learned to drive a 1936 Oliver Hart Par 70, and I have that tractor, but it's unrestored as yet.
Collectors are a fussy breed. A case man wouldn't be caught dead sitting on a John Deere unless he lost a bet. This Case VAC is painted flambeau red, a color patented by Case in 1939. It marked a departure from the utilitarian gray enamel, and also a big step forward for case designs. They tended to stand out in a field, all right. J.R. Geiger of Lebanon, Indiana, has put together a representative collection of fully restored case tractors, showing many variations on the theme from the 1930s to the 1960s. J.R.'s son, Jay, keeps up the tradition working with that big air-conditioned closed-cab case Magnum that started the program. Now, Ernie Weissert here is sitting on top of the world astride his Minneapolis Moline high crop. He's retired, and his two sons, Mark and Steve, farm the place. Ernie and his wife, Joanne, have time to enjoy the social side of tractor collecting, attending shows and threshermen's reunions across the Midwest, helping keep the tradition of Minneapolis Moline tractors alive and well. These massively built machines enjoyed a reputation for power and dependability that survives today. The Model U was one of the larger tractors of its time. It was just about the first tractor to burn propane. It could haul a 3- or 4-bottom plow and was built until 1955. These other mini-mows, in their prairie gold color schemes, are all working tractors on Ernie's farm. The man watching his plow here is Tom Graverson, who helped us put this show together. He's aboard his case from the 1940s, as befits a true case man. This Model DH is rare as hen's teeth. Case only built 82 of them. Tom's tractors are scattered through this program. We do have footage of Tom driving a John Deere, but we promise not to show it. He's towing his rare Case D70 disc plow from 1937. Now that is a 2-bottom plow. Farmers identify a plow by the number of implements, or bottoms, doing the work. We'll see more of that and his other implements later on when we look at what tractors actually do out there in the field. The Allis-Chalmers bloodline dates back to the turn of the century and includes both our old friend, the horseless 612 motor cultivator of 1917, and also the heritage of the brawny Rumely 6 of 1930. Their evolution led to the famous D-Series that turned the soil during the late 1950s and through the 1960s. This collection of Ds has been preserved in original condition by Norman Steinman of Bourbon, Indiana. Some collectors prefer to maintain the original paint, tires, and engine parts like any fine old antique instead of repainting them. The most unique part of Normie's collection isn't a tractor, but is an ungainly-looking box of a machine that sounded the death knell to the binder and the threshing machine. A product that grew up in the newly acquired Rumely plant in LaPorte, Indiana, and came to be called the All-Crop Combine. It was introduced in 1938 and was an immediate hit. Made of pressed steel sheets held together with spot welds, the lightweight combine could be pulled by an average-sized tractor and could be used on the owner's farm and to do custom work at his neighbor's farms for $3 cash money an acre. Walt Bruscher, a former Allis-Chalmers salesman, once wrote, "It was said at the time that the all-crop harvester built more fences, painted more barns, redesigned more kitchens than any other farm machine ever. All from the profits earned by this little machine." As Norm Steinman demonstrates, the all-crop attached to the tractor's power takeoff shaft. When drawn by the tractor, the combine cuts a swath of grain onto the feeder and threshes the kernels from the chaff. It was originally designed to thresh oats, wheat, barley, and rye, but experimentation showed it could separate crops as tiny as clover seed. Eventually, a book was compiled that listed over 100 crops that could be threshed with the all-crop. By 1949, over 176,000 of these machines had been built. Whether they are very rare, or have a unique beauty, or have a particular sound, or they help keep alive a tradition, or maybe they change the history of farming, these fine examples of American agricultural technology have a constant appeal for the farmer collector. Up to this point, we've looked at almost every type of tractor under the sun. But not everyone watching this program knows what these machines actually do out there in the field. To close this gap in agricultural knowledge, we're going to use some antique tractors and implements to turn over and plant a patch of prime acreage on Ernie Weisert's farm. Now, this hardware is some 40 years old or more, but the process hasn't changed much down through the years. Come on, Tom, time to get to work. To start with, the ground has to be broken and tilled with a plow. This Case D70 disc plow throws a fine rooster tail of rich dirt. It is a rare type with two 26-inch discs used mainly out west over harder and stonier ground than we have here, and with a lot less moisture than you find in Indiana in May. That Model DH, by the way, was one of the first series of styled tractors ever built by Case back in 1940. She could burn kerosene or gas. You can see how hard Tom is working. Imagine plowing up a few hundred acres with this rig under a hot sun. Once the ground was turned over and plowed into furrows, it had to be worked down, or worked up if you're from out east. That was the job for this Case Model R power-controlled disc harrow, hitched behind Tom's DH. The implement is equipped with 18-inch discs spaced at 7 inches on each axle. The disc harrow is designed to cut the soil and mix it. The angle of these discs is controlled by a lever to set the proper depth. Once set, the disc harrow can be angled or straightened by a clutch, operated by a rope or chain from the driver's seat. This method sort of predated the later power lift built into more modern tractors. The final step before planting makes use of an International Harvester 3-section spring-tooth harrow. After plowing and disking, the furrows are still too rough for seeding. It's the job of the harrow, hooked up behind Ernie on his Mini-Mow Model R, to level the soil in preparation to laying down the seedbed. Usually, it was pulled at a slight angle across the field, smoothing the soil so the farmer could see his mark at the end of the row in order to turn accurately and plant the next row. The planting step is where we take a small departure in order to show a device that took the drudgery out of hand planting corn, the check row planter. Ernie has his early 1940s version mounted behind his Minneapolis Moline Model Z, the first tractor he ever owned. First, field hands, in this case Ernie and his dad, Doc Weisert, lay out a steel wire about a 1/4 inch thick, linked together in sections. The planter has a guide built into it through which passes this wire. As each link in the wire passes through the guide, it trips a lever that works a cam, which in turn drops from 2 to 5 corn seeds into the ground. When the farmer arrived at the end of the row, he raised the planter with a lever next to his seat, turned the tractor, found his mark for the front wheels made in the soil by the extended row marker, reconnected the wire, and came back down the next row. This seems slow and painstaking, but the design dates back to horseplow days and was a considerable jump up from making a hole, dropping the seed, covering the hole, and moving on. Now, we move out of the field to meet a unique individual who built his own tractor. Bernie Isert is a bona fide jack-of-all-trades who just happens to like building half-size replicas of steam traction engines. This is an exactly proportioned model of a Case 110-horsepower steamer he built from the ground up. Boiler, pistons, wheels, and spokes. He did it all in 1 year's time. He also farms, built his home and the sheds that hold his eclectic tractor collection. And in his spare time, he cuts his own wood, both on a full-size sawmill and this half-size mill powered by a 65-horsepower steam engine, which he also built from scratch. Bernie's wife, Mary Jane, is his partner. She works with him in the sawmill. She farms with him and manages a farm-sized vegetable garden from which she puts up preserved goods for the winter. This 65-horsepower Case runs the sawmill just like the full-size version back near the turn of the century, and requires the same tender, loving care. He loads coal into the firebox, constantly checks the valves and steam pressure, keeping his eye on the spinning governor. Safety valves spout off, showing there's plenty of heat in the firebox and steam in the boiler to keep the mill working. Bernie is a craftsman and knows his way around a farm and a machine shop. He's one of a breed that sets up challenges for his skills just for the pleasure of accomplishment. Taking a step even further back in time, this scene was a common sight across rural America in the 19th century. Would you look at that? Belgian and Percheron horses, hitched 3 abreast, pulling a sulky plow through the rich Indiana soil. It's early evening, and the setting sun's last rays stream through the trees, highlighting the freshly turned ground. This is the way it was done before farmers harnessed steam and the internal combustion engine, and stepped from the soft jingle of the harness and squeak of the wheels into the roar and clatter of our industrial 20th century. Jeff Swartzel and his grandson Nathan span a generation that dawned when tractor farming was already middle-aged. Although they farm with tractors today, they are working up the ground with horses, celebrating the heritage of farm life in bygone days. Behind them is Jeff's brother Don, plowing with an Emerson one-bottom plow. Jeff's plow is a John Deere, big improvements back then over the walking plow. Your view of the world, however, was somewhat depressing over the long hours of the day. Each year, they set aside this 35-acre patch to work their horses and reestablish their connection to the land. 2 generations of farmers taking us back 100 years. Preserving a touch with the farming past isn't restricted to farmers who work the land. There is a way to collect tractors without having a farm and sheds to store them. This is the world of the toy tractor collector. Built to exact scale, these models reflect the step-by-step changes in agriculture's mechanical evolution. The collection belongs to Jerry Jones, a landscape contractor from Winamac, Indiana. Jerry strongly favors the John Deere, but is eclectic enough to include everything from construction equipment and model cars to international harvester, Farmalls, and Minneapolis Molines. Some of the models are very rare, dating back to the days when the real tractors were built. Jerry is more than a collector. He has built some of these models from scratch, machining parts from blocks of aluminum, sheets of plastic, and lengths of brass wire. One other area where Jerry's collection really shines is animation. This four-wheel drive Case Model 1200 Traction King and its set of discs looks like it could drive out of the picture. Here's an animated planter that operates exactly like the full-size version. Jerry uses actual oil-operated hydraulics buried in the tabletop for these scenes. This authentic baler model is powered by a hidden battery. Jerry is one of thousands of tractor collectors across the country displaying models that are both valued antiques and scratch-built examples of the model builder's art. There are, of course, looking at miniatures and working miniatures. This little red tractor, this little Flambeau tractor, has a counterpart that works in the field, but the short version's designed to be operated by a little farmer-to-be. Pedal tractors are the big wheels of the farm kids. The first pedal tractor was carved out of wood in the basement of Harold Heller of Dubuque, Iowa in 1947. When Heller finished his model, he took it to John Deere and to International Harvester, and this great promotional idea was born. Heller formed a company called Tractoy, which merged with the Eska Company of Dubuque, Iowa. From 1949 to 1960, Eska built pedal tractors for John Deere, International Harvester, Case, Massey Harris, Ford, Oliver, and Allis-Chalmers. In 1960, the Ertl Company of Dyersville, Iowa took over production. Some are still made today. These pedal tractors are part of the collection belonging to Norm Steinman, and the assembled group seen here, including this very rare crawler and the extremely rare mounted corn picker, are worth thousands of dollars. This red one with the little trailer Norm built himself for his granddaughter from Busted Parts. It's his favorite. They represent one more way the traditions of the American farmer are passed on to the next generation. So there you have it, a look at part of the history of the tractor and today's tractor culture, told through the collections of working farmers, a skilled craftsman who builds his own, the toy collection and pedal tractors of the next generation. From the horse-drawn plows of the 19th century, the giant steam traction engines at the turn of that century, on down to the mechanical innovations that have helped America feed the world, we've walked a pretty big field. We have to thank these men and their very supportive and patiently understanding wives for the chance to see what it was really like growing up plowing the land for 100 years of agricultural history. If we still have to ask why they spend their efforts in this constant search for their corner of the historical record, Bernie Izard, the steam engine builder, said it best.
I guess the most important reason why I got into steam was for the preservation of a lost art, something that a generation or two down the road nobody will understand unless there's a few of us that can keep this thing a-going.